this is Siri from Siri Tutor Blogs, and welcome to my channel BA Artifact series. And today we are going to cover dependency mapping. In our last blog, I have already covered data mapping series. So please check that out if you missed it. And I will also tell you the difference at the end between what is the difference between data mapping and dependency mapping. So before we dive in into the answer, I would like to request you all to please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. So dependency mapping is a visual representation which shows how a API or a process or a functionality depends on other system API or a process to function correctly. So it is very common in any domains like fintech, retail, or enterprise environment where systems interact with each other using APIs, database, or external services. So dependency mapping helps the team to understand how the system relationship, the API integrations, the team ownership, downstream and upstream impacts, failure impacts, and sprint sequencing. So let's look into a simple example. Say like we order a food online, and in the mobile app it depends on the login authentication. So unless the authentication is successful, the app will not be able to place an order, right? In the same way, the dispute APIs or dispute services depends on transaction API. So as you know, when the transaction is not authorized, it has to go through the dispute transaction process to resolve the transaction. So to have a case, to create a case for the dispute, it all depends upon the transaction, if the transaction exists or not, or if transaction is a valid one or not. So unless the transaction API is successful, the dispute API cannot function properly. The dispute so dependency API, dependency mapping help us to prevent integration failures or missing APIs or unexpected production outage, inconsistent data, or or release conflicts. So all these things we can prevent and we can avoid using dependency mapping. So it's very important to for a technical business analyst to document dependency mapping. Uh, so because in any domain, say for example a retail, when you make a transaction, if you make a checkout, it happens a transaction, right? And transaction involves multiple steps in the process. Like the transaction starts with the UI portal, and it goes to the authentication API, and it goes to the transaction API is another APIs. From there, it goes to the fraud API, to the payment gateways, to the notification APIs, to the reporting APIs, and to the databases. So, if any one system fails, the entire process is impacted. The rest of the downstream systems are affected or may not work, may stop working. So it is very important for us to determine the dependency mapping before going ahead with the development process. And so we use dependency mapping right from the early stage, from the requirement gathering onwards, to understand the system interactions, and during the design solution, to identify the integration points. In the sprint planning also we use dependency mapping to determine the development order. And during the plannings release planning, so here we have to understand the release dependencies. And during the QA and integration test, in this process we have to understand what are the different integration tests, supporting integration tests we have to do. And during the support production, um, we have to analyze what are the impacted systems. And during the change management also we use dependency matrix, dependency mapping, to assess what are the downstream systems that are impacted. So as a business technical business analyst, we have to identify the system interactions, um, to see which systems, what are the what APIs communicate, um, what API communicates, which system depends on another system, and which are upstream and downstream systems. This will help us identifying, okay, UI depends on authenticate, like the initial login depends upon the authentication, or the dispute depends on the transaction. In the same way, we have to identify and define the team ownership. So in this process we have to define which team owns what APIs, and which team is responsible to handle any kind of failures, so that it will help us improving the communication, coordination, and easy escalation during the production issues. When there is a production ticket, we can easily escalate these issues, right? And supporting the um, release planning. So in this, we have to understand the sprint sequencing, deployment planning, and planning coordination. This will help us to understand, um, we cannot release UI feature unless the backend services are ready or complete, right? Like any database services are not ready, we cannot release UI until that release is ready. And the next thing is the risk or fraud handling. So as a business analyst, you have to determine the error handling, the retry mechanism, and the fallback logic. So if say like the fraud services are unavailable, this will definitely make the dispute APIs fail. So we have to analyze where can we apply the retry logic, where can we apply the fallback mechanism. So this dependency mapping will help us to identify all those areas. And the next thing is QA and integration testing. In the QA and integration testing, the QA uses this dependency mapping uh, to identify the API failures and invalid responses, timeout scenarios, and for the to find the impacts on the downstream systems. So let's summarize. Before we wrap up, also, I just wanted to show you how we have to create dependency mapping, how we have to create the tables, and what are the tools that we are going to use for the dependency mapping. We will get into that. And let's summarize. So, as a business, as a technical business analyst, I create this dependency mapping to identify the integration points, to define the team ownership, and to analyze the upstream and downstream impacts, and 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 to support release management and risk management. So this dependency mapping is a high level visual representation that allows different APIs or systems or features to depend on other API systems or features in the application ecosystem. For example, if we take a FinTech dispute transaction process, the UI feature always depend upon authentication API, and whereas the dispute API depends on the transaction API and the fraud API, whereas the notification API depends on the dispute case ID to be created before sending out the confirmation. So, so, uh, so this is very important to understand the dependency mapping. The main two differences between dependency mapping and data mapping is dependency mapping helps us to determine which system depends on which system, whereas data mapping helps us uh, which field data is going to go where. So that is the difference. So this is data mapping is at field level, and dependency mapping is at the system level. And yeah, in a API driven system, this data dependency mapping is very critical to understand the integration points, sprint sequencing, um, failure impacts, and the ownership. So, as a business, as a technical business analyst, I use dependency mapping along with the data mapping to ensure all systems and data integrate correctly in the enterprise architecture. So let's look into the dependency mapping tables to understand how, as a business analyst, we have to come up with a dependency mapping. How can we document dependency mapping? So, so here is the consolidated dependency ownership table. So the way we understand this is we have a system or feature, whatever the system or feature, and who owns it, and on which it depends on which functionality does it depends on to for this to be successful, and what is the main purpose of this flow. Okay, so right now we will look at UI portal, and UI portal is owned by the UI team, and that UI portal depends on authentication API or transaction API. If any of these APIs are fail or down, the UI portal will not be successful to place an order or to do the request, to make the request successfully. So the main purpose of this authentication API is for the customer interaction. It's for a customer querying back and forth. Okay. The next one is authentication API is owned by security team, and it depends upon DB. So if the DB is down, or is it, if it's not ready, this authentication API will not be successful. We cannot check if the user is a valid user or not, right? So this, the main purpose of this flow is for user validation. And the next one is transaction API. So the transaction API is owned by transaction team, and what it does is it transaction DB. It depends on transaction DB to ensure if the DB is having transactions data to validate if the transaction is a valid transaction, if it is within the 90 days period, or it is a valid transaction, or does this transaction exist. So to retrieve the transactions, transaction API depends on transaction DB. So if the DB is not ready, if the DB is down, it cannot retrieve any transactions. So that is where the dependency lies. In the same way, the dispute API depends on, is owned by the dispute team, and it is dependent on transaction API and fraud API. And the main purpose is for to create a dispute. The next one is the fraud service, which is owned by the risk a team, and the fraud rule engine. It depends upon the fraud rule engine, where it runs or validates all the business rules, and the main purpose is the fraud validation. In the same way, notification team, and it depends on dispute API. Unless the dispute creates a case ID, it cannot send out a notification to the customers. And reporting API is a reporting team, owned by reporting team, and it depends upon the dispute DB. If the every reporting system retrieves the data from the DB. If the DB is down, it cannot do. So it is mainly, the main purpose is for auditing and reconciliation. Okay, for the verification. So here is the dependency risks. If the fraud API is unavailable, the dispute fails to process. If the transaction API is timed out, the transaction is not displayed. And the same way, notification services fail, the customer receives no confirmation. And if authentication API fails, user cannot access the portal. These are the tools which we use for creating the dependency mapping. We use Visio, Lucid Charts, Drawing.io, Miro, Confluence, and Jira. Any of these tools can be used to create these dependency mapping. It's very important for every like in the IT sector, when you're working mainly towards the application development side, as a part of application development, in the development QA or business analyst, or at the product side, it's very important for you to know this dependency mapping. I hope you like my video, you enjoyed my video, and please, I would like to request you to please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you, and take care. Bye.